The construction worker's drill bit caught something that wasn't wood. Marcus Chen paused, wiping sweat from his forehead as he examined the resistance his Milwaukee M18 had encountered in the ship's hull. The Mayflower II renovation had been proceeding smoothly for 3 months, but this section of the lower deck felt different, hollow in places where the original 1957 blueprints indicated solid timber. When he pulled the drill back, a metallic glint caught the October morning light streaming through the museum ship's portholes. Detective Lieutenant Sarah Morrison received the call at 9:47 a.m. on October 15, 2024. She'd been reviewing case files in her cramped office at the Plymouth Police Department when the radio crackled to life. Possible human remains discovered aboard the Mayflower II replica. The word sent a familiar chill down her spine. After 23 years in law enforcement, she'd learned to trust that instinct. What she couldn't have known was that this discovery would unravel the most perplexing missing persons case in Massachusetts history, one that had haunted the small coastal town for over 4 decades. The ship rocked gently against its moorings as Morrison climbed aboard at 10:15 a.m. The familiar scent of salt air mixed with sawdust and varnish filled her nostrils. Chen led her to the section where he'd been working, pointing to a carefully cut opening in what appeared to be a false wall. "I've been doing restoration work for 15 years, he said, his voice tight with unease. "This isn't original construction. Someone added this compartment later." Morrison crouched beside the opening, her latex gloves scraping against the rough edges of aged wood. Inside the cramped space, approximately 4 feet wide and 2 feet deep, lay a collection of items that made her breath catch. 32 plastic name badges, each bearing the cheerful logo of Millbrook Elementary School, were arranged in neat rows. The badges were discolored but legible. "Hello, my name is," followed by childish handwriting in faded blue ink. Jennifer Walsh, Michael Rodriguez, Katie Thompson. Names that Morrison recognized from files she'd studied countless times, though she'd never expected to work the case herself. The Plymouth Rock disappearance of 1983 was local legend. Morrison had been a sophomore at Plymouth High School when it happened, old enough to remember the helicopters circling overhead and the state police cars lined up along Water Street. 32 fourth graders from nearby Millbrook Elementary had vanished during a routine field trip to Plymouth Rock and the Mayflower II on November 18, 1983. No bodies were ever found. No witnesses came forward. No ransom demands were made. The children had simply ceased to exist between the hours of 1:30 p.m. and 3 p.m. on a gray autumn afternoon. As Morrison photographed each badge with her Canon EOS R5, she recalled the basic facts that every local resident knew by heart. The field trip had been organized by fourth-grade teacher Ellen Hartwell, a 34-year-old woman who'd taught at Millbrook for 8 years. 2 parent volunteers had accompanied the group: Robert Clemens, a local insurance agent, and Maria Santos, a nurse at Jordan Hospital. The children had visited Plymouth Rock first, then boarded the Mayflower II for their scheduled tour at 1:30 p.m. When the tour guide arrived at 3 p.m. to collect the next group, he found the ship empty except for the 3 adult chaperones, who were discovered unconscious in the ship's hold. The adults had suffered what appeared to be severe concussions. All 3 were hospitalized for several days, awakening with no memory of the 2.5-hour period during which the children vanished. Medical examinations revealed traces of an unknown sedative in their bloodstreams, but the compound was never identified. The case had consumed local law enforcement for years, spawning countless theories and false leads. Some believed the children had been trafficked. Others suspected a mass kidnapping by a cult. A few whispered about supernatural explanations, given Plymouth's proximity to Salem and its witch trial history. Morrison's phone buzzed with a text from crime scene technician Luis Delgado, ETA 20 minutes, bringing full kit. She secured the scene with yellow tape and began documenting the compartment's construction. The false wall had been expertly crafted, designed to blend seamlessly with the ship's original 16th century styling. Whoever had built it possessed considerable carpentry skills and intimate knowledge of the vessel's layout. The work appeared to have been done sometime in the 1980s, based on the wood's aging and the construction techniques used. As Morrison waited for the crime scene team, she examined the badges more closely. Each one bore not just a name, but also a small photograph of a smiling child. The images were standard school photos, the kind taken every fall for yearbooks and family albums. Seeing the faces brought an unexpected wave of emotion. These weren't just case files anymore. They were real children who'd been someone's entire world. Jennifer Walsh had pigtails and a gap-toothed grin. Michael Rodriguez wore a dinosaur-themed shirt. Katie Thompson had drawn a heart next to her name in purple crayon. The badges themselves told a story. They were remarkably well preserved, suggesting they'd been placed in the compartment shortly after the disappearance. The plastic showed minimal degradation, and the adhesive backing was still intact. Most importantly, there was no evidence of blood, soil, or other materials that might indicate the children had been harmed before the badges were removed. This detail would prove crucial in the investigation to come. Delgado arrived at 10:35 a.m. with his partner, Amy Walsh, no relation to the missing Jennifer Walsh, though the coincidence wasn't lost on Morrison. The crime scene team methodically documented the compartment, taking measurements, photographs, and samples of the wood and adhesive residue. They also discovered something Morrison had missed, a small piece of paper wedged into the corner of the space, bearing the partial imprint of a shipping label. While the technicians worked, Morrison contacted the Massachusetts State Police Major Case Unit. The original investigation had been handled by both local and state authorities, but the case had remained under Plymouth jurisdiction. Detective Captain James Henley, who'd been a rookie patrolman in 1983, would coordinate with the state team. Morrison had worked with Henley for over a decade and knew he'd been haunted by the case throughout his career. "The families deserve answers," Henley said when Morrison called him. "Some of them never stopped looking. Others moved away, couldn't stand living with the constant reminders. You know Elena Rodriguez still holds a vigil every November 18th at Plymouth Rock?" Morrison did know. Elena Rodriguez, Michael's mother, had become the unofficial spokesperson for the families over the years. She'd organized search parties, pressured politicians, and kept the case in the public eye when media attention waned. At 73, she remained tireless in her pursuit of answers, though Morrison could hear the toll it had taken in her voice whenever they spoke. The discovery of the badges made the front page of the Plymouth County Herald within hours. By evening, news vans lined Water Street as reporters prepared live broadcasts for the Boston area stations. Morrison found herself thrust into the spotlight, fielding questions she couldn't answer, and managing expectations she couldn't meet. The badges were evidence, but they weren't children. They were clues, but not solutions. Dr. Patricia Vance, a forensic anthropologist from Boston University, arrived the following morning to examine the compartment for any trace of human remains. Using ground-penetrating radar and chemical analysis tools, she methodically searched the ship's hull and surrounding areas. The work was painstaking, requiring careful coordination to avoid damaging the historic vessel while thoroughly investigating every possible hiding place. The compartment was professionally constructed, Dr. Vance explained to Morrison as they stood in the ship's restored passenger quarters. The wood joints are precise, the hidden hinges are high quality. This wasn't the work of an amateur. Someone with significant carpentry experience built this specifically to remain hidden. The investigation team expanded to include Detective Sergeant Nicole Chen from the State Police, a specialist in cold case analysis. Chen had successfully reopened several decades-old cases using modern forensic techniques and database searches. Her approach was methodical and data-driven, focusing on patterns and connections that might have been missed in the original investigation. Chen's first step was to digitize all the original case files, creating a comprehensive database of witness statements, physical evidence, and investigative notes. The 1983 investigation had generated over 3,000 pages of documents, including interviews with 247 witnesses, forensic reports from the FBI laboratory, and psychological profiles of potential suspects. Reading through the files, Chen noticed several inconsistencies that had been overlooked or inadequately explored. The most significant discrepancy involved a timeline. The original investigation had assumed the children disappeared between 1:30 p.m. and 3 p.m., based on the scheduled tour times. However, several witnesses reported seeing the school bus in the parking area as late as 2:15 p.m. A dock worker named Thomas Brennan had given a statement about helping the children disembark from the ship around 2 p.m., but this testimony had been dismissed because it contradicted the official timeline. Chen located Brennan, now 79, and living in a nursing home in Brockton. Though his memory had faded, he maintained that he'd helped the children off the ship and watched them walk toward the museum building. They were excited, chattering about the ship, he recalled during their interview. The teacher was keeping them in line, making sure they didn't run ahead. It was a normal field trip, nothing unusual about it. This revelation shifted the investigation's focus. If the children had left the ship as scheduled, they must have vanished somewhere between the dock and the museum, or possibly from the museum itself. The museum building had been extensively searched in 1983, but Chen decided to re-examine it with modern equipment and techniques. The Mayflower II Museum occupied a colonial-style building constructed in 1962, featuring exhibits about the Pilgrim's voyage and life in Plymouth Colony. The building had undergone several renovations over the years, adding new display areas and modernizing the visitor facilities. Chen requested the architectural plans for all modifications, looking for any spaces that might have been sealed or forgotten during construction. The plans revealed an interesting detail. During a 1984 renovation, less than a year after the disappearance, a section of the basement had been converted from storage space to a climate-controlled archive. The renovation had been funded by an anonymous donor and completed by Clemens Construction, a local company owned by Robert Clemens, the same Robert Clemens who'd been a parent volunteer on the field trip. Morrison and Chen visited the museum on October 20th, accompanied by building superintendent Frank Kowalski. The archive area was accessible through a keycard-secured door marked Authorized Personnel Only. Inside, they found rows of metal shelving containing document boxes, artifacts, and photographic collections. The room felt cold and sterile, with fluorescent lighting that cast harsh shadows across the concrete floor. This whole section was just empty storage before Mr. Clemens paid for the renovation, Kowalski explained. He said he wanted to help preserve Plymouth's history. The museum board was grateful. We'd been needing proper archive space for years. Chen examined the room's layout, noting that it was significantly larger than the space shown on the current floor plans. "What's behind that wall?" she asked, pointing to a section that appeared to extend beyond the building's foundation. Kowalski frowned, consulting his blueprints. "I'm not sure. The plans show this as an exterior wall, but it's clearly interior space." He knocked on the wall, producing a hollow sound that suggested empty space beyond. "That's odd. I've worked here for 12 years, and I never noticed this discrepancy." Morrison felt the familiar tingle of discovery. "We're going to need to see what's behind that wall." The following morning, Chen obtained a search warrant for the museum basement. The legal process had been expedited given the potential connection to the missing children, but Morrison knew they had only one chance to examine the space before lawyers and bureaucrats complicated the situation. Marcus Chen, relation to Detective Chen, returned with his construction crew to carefully remove a section of the drywall. Behind it, they discovered another professionally constructed hidden compartment, this one much larger than the space found on the ship. The room was approximately 12 feet by 8 feet, with concrete walls and a dropped ceiling that had been insulated to muffle sound. Inside the hidden room, they found evidence that made Morrison's hands shake as she photographed each item. 32 small backpacks, each labeled with a child's name in the same handwriting that had appeared on the field trip permission slips. The backpacks contained personal items, lunch boxes, pencil cases, small toys, and homework assignments. Everything a fourth grader would have brought on a field trip. But there was more. Against one wall stood a row of child-sized chairs, arranged as if for a class presentation. On a small table at the front of the room lay a teacher's lesson plan, written in Ellen Hartwell's distinctive handwriting. The plan outlined an educational presentation about colonial life, complete with costumes and props. It was dated November 18, 1983. Chen documented each item with forensic precision, but Morrison found herself drawn to the personal effects. Michael Rodriguez's Superman lunchbox, Jennifer Walsh's pink pencil case with unicorn stickers, Katie Thompson's homework assignment, a math worksheet with problems only half completed. These weren't just evidence. They were the last traces of 32 young lives. Dr. Vance arrived with her team to process the scene, searching for any biological evidence that might indicate what had happened to the children. The work was meticulous, requiring chemical analysis of every surface and microscopic examination of fabric fibers, hair samples, and skin cells. The process would take weeks, but initial results suggested the children had been in the room for an extended period. The arrangement suggests they were seated for some kind of presentation, Dr. Vance explained. The wear patterns on the chairs indicate regular use over several days, possibly weeks. This wasn't a brief stop. It was a destination. Morrison struggled with the implications. The hidden room had been constructed before the disappearance, suggesting premeditation. Someone had planned to bring the children here, had prepared a space for them, and had gone to extraordinary lengths to conceal their presence. But why? And where were they now? The investigation team expanded again, bringing in FBI behavioral analysts and specialists in child trafficking cases. The discovery of the hidden room had elevated the case to federal jurisdiction, though Morrison remained the lead detective. The FBI's involvement brought resources and expertise that the Plymouth Police Department couldn't provide. But it also brought bureaucracy and politics that complicated the investigation. Special Agent Rebecca Torres had worked child exploitation cases for 12 years and had seen the darkest aspects of human nature. Her assessment of the hidden room was clinical but disturbing. This space was designed for long-term containment, she explained during a briefing at the Plymouth Police Department. The soundproofing, the furniture arrangement, the ventilation system. Someone planned to keep children here for an extended period. Torres's preliminary profile suggested they were looking for someone with access to the museum, construction skills, and significant financial resources. The person would have needed to plan the operation months in advance, studying the children's routines and identifying opportunities to execute the abduction. Most importantly, they would have needed a way to transport 32 children from the hidden room to another location without detection. "We're not looking for a random predator," Torres continued. "This was an organized operation, possibly involving multiple individuals. The level of planning and resources required suggests someone with deep connections to the community." Morrison found herself thinking about Robert Clemens, the parent volunteer who'd later funded the museum renovation. Clemens had been unconscious when the children vanished, apparently suffering from the same unknown sedative that had affected the other adults. But his company had constructed the hidden room, and he'd had access to the museum for months during the renovation project. Chen had already begun investigating Clemens's background, discovering several interesting connections. Clemens Construction had been awarded numerous municipal contracts in the 1980s, including work on the Plymouth Elementary School system. The company had also been involved in renovation projects at several other historical sites throughout southeastern Massachusetts, always focusing on preservation and archive development. Robert Clemens himself had died in 1997, but his son David had continued the family business. Morrison and Chen visited David Clemens at his office on Court Street, finding him cooperative, but visibly shaken by the discovery of the hidden room. At 53, David bore a strong resemblance to his father, with the same broad shoulders and calloused hands that spoke of years in construction work. "My father never got over what happened on that field trip," David said, pouring coffee from a pot that had seen better days. He blamed himself for not being able to protect those kids. The fact that he was unconscious when they vanished haunted him for the rest of his life. Morrison studied David's face, looking for signs of deception. "Did your father ever mention building the hidden room in the museum?" "Not directly," David replied, his hands fidgeting with a pencil. "But he worked on that renovation project for months. He was obsessed with doing it right, said it was his way of honoring the children. He worked nights and weekends, wouldn't let anyone else handle the electrical or structural work." Chen leaned forward. "Did you ever visit the work site?" "A few times. Dad was proud of the archive space, said it would preserve Plymouth's history for future generations. He showed me the climate control system, the security features. It was more sophisticated than anything we'd installed before." Morrison felt the pieces beginning to align. "What about the hidden room? Did you see any evidence of construction that wasn't on the official plans?" David's expression changed, becoming more guarded. "I was only 26 then, still learning the business. Dad handled all the design work himself. But—" He paused, seeming to wrestle with a memory. "There was one night when I came by the site unexpectedly. Dad was working in the basement, and he seemed surprised to see me. He quickly closed off an area he was working on. Said it was just storage space that wasn't ready for inspection." "Do you remember when this was?" Chen asked. "It would have been spring of 1984, a few months after the renovation started. Dad was working 7 days a week then, pushing to get the project finished. He said the museum board was pressuring him to complete the work quickly. Morrison made notes, feeling the investigation's momentum building. David, I need to ask you something directly. Do you think your father was involved in the children's disappearance? David Clemens was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the harbor. Detective, I loved my father. He was a good man who worked hard and cared about his community. But after the field trip, he changed. He became obsessed with the case, collected newspaper clippings, attended every vigil. He donated money to the search efforts, helped organize volunteer searches. If he was involved, it would have been the greatest deception of his life. But you're not saying no, Morrison observed. I'm saying I don't know, and that scares me more than I can express. The investigation team spent the next week analyzing the construction records for the museum renovation. The official blueprints showed no evidence of the hidden room, but they discovered that Robert Clemens had filed several change orders during the project, claiming they were necessary for structural integrity. The change orders were vague, describing quote-unquote foundation reinforcement and utility modifications without specific details. Chen also uncovered financial records showing that Clemens had paid for the renovation with a combination of insurance money and personal funds. The insurance payment had come from a policy on his construction business, claiming equipment damage from a fire that had occurred in December 1983, just weeks after the disappearance. The fire had been investigated and ruled accidental, but the timing was suspicious. Morrison visited the Plymouth Fire Department to review the incident report. Captain Michael Sullivan, who'd been a firefighter in 1983, remembered the call. It was a strange fire, he said, pulling the file from a metal cabinet. Started in the equipment storage area, destroyed mostly paperwork and small tools. Bob Clemens was devastated, said years of project records were lost. Did you find any evidence of arson? Morrison asked. We looked, but there was nothing definitive. The fire started near an electrical panel, could have been faulty wiring, but Bob seemed almost relieved afterward, like he was glad to see certain things destroyed. Morrison studied the fire report, noting that the blaze had occurred on December 3, 1983, exactly 15 days after the children's disappearance. The destroyed materials included project blueprints, client files, and employee records dating back to 1980. If Clemens had been involved in the disappearance, the fire would have eliminated crucial evidence. The investigation took another turn when Chen discovered that Ellen Hartwell, the teacher who'd supervised the field trip, had received a significant inheritance just months before the disappearance. The money had come from a great-aunt in Vermont, a woman Hartwell had rarely mentioned to friends or colleagues. The inheritance was substantial, nearly $50,000 in $1,983, enough to change a teacher's life significantly. Morrison and Chen traveled to Montpelier, Vermont to investigate the inheritance. They found that Ellen Hartwell's great-aunt, Margaret Hartwell, had indeed existed and had left a substantial estate. But the inheritance had been processed through a law firm that specialized in estate planning for wealthy clients, not the typical lawyer a retired librarian would use. Attorney James Morrison, no relation to Detective Morrison, had handled the estate. At 81, he was still practicing law from a small office near the Vermont State House. His memory of the case was clear, partly because it had been unusual in several ways. Margaret Hartwell was a careful woman, Attorney Morrison explained. She'd been planning her estate for years, updating her will regularly. But the final version, the one that left everything to her great-niece, was executed just 6 months before her death. It was also the only version that mentioned Ellen Hartwell at all. Chen examined the will, noting that it had been witnessed by 2 employees of a private investigation firm. This was unusual. Most wills were witnessed by law office staff or notaries. The investigation firm had gone out of business years earlier, making it impossible to interview the witnesses. Did you ever meet Ellen Hartwell personally? Morrison asked. Just once, when she came to collect the inheritance. She seemed nervous, kept asking about the confidentiality of the proceedings. She specifically wanted to know if anyone else would be told about the money. Morrison felt the familiar tingle of discovery. Did she say why she was concerned about confidentiality? She said she was worried about people asking for loans or expecting her to pay for things. but her concern seemed deeper than that, more like fear than embarrassment. The Vermont investigation revealed another interesting detail. Margaret Hartwell had died in a nursing home in Burlington, but she'd been moved there from her longtime residence in Brattleboro just 2 weeks before her death. The nursing home staff remembered her as confused and frightened, constantly asking about someone named Robert who was supposed to help her. Morrison and Chin visited the Brattleboro house, now occupied by a young family who'd purchased it from the estate. The couple was helpful, providing access to the basement and attic spaces where they'd found boxes of Margaret Hartwell's belongings. Most items were typical household effects, but they discovered a small cache of letters hidden in a false bottom of an old trunk. The letters were correspondence between Margaret Hartwell and Robert Clemens, dating from 1982 to 1983. The early letters were businesslike, discussing Clemens's construction work on the woman's property. But the later letters revealed a disturbing relationship. Clemens had been pressuring Margaret Hartwell to change her will, claiming that Ellen Hartwell needed financial help to pursue an important educational project. "Ellen is doing important work with children," one letter read. "The project will help kids learn about history in a way they've never experienced before. But it requires resources and privacy to be successful. Your support would make a real difference in these children's lives." The letters became more insistent over time, with Clemens describing Ellen Hartwell's project in increasingly urgent terms. The final letter, dated just weeks before Margaret Hartwell's death, was almost threatening. "The project is moving forward regardless of your decision. Ellen has committed to the children, and she won't let them down. Your support would ensure everything goes smoothly." Morrison photographed each letter, feeling the investigation's focus shifting. The correspondence suggested that Robert Clemens and Ellen Hartwell had been planning something together, something that required significant financial resources and absolute secrecy. The inheritance money would have provided those resources, allowing them to execute whatever plan they developed. Back in Plymouth, the crime scene team had completed their analysis of the hidden room. The results were disturbing but not conclusive. They'd found evidence that 32 children had been in the room for an extended period, possibly as long as 2 weeks. The children had been fed and cared for. There was no evidence of violence or neglect. But they'd also been confined, with the door locked from the outside and no means of escape. Dr. Vance's report included a chilling detail. The children's belongings showed signs of organization and routine, suggesting they'd been encouraged to maintain normal activities like homework and games. One wall of the room had been decorated with educational posters about colonial life, and they'd found evidence that the children had been given art supplies and encouraged to draw pictures of their experience. "Someone was trying to make this feel like an extended field trip," Dr. Vance explained. "The children were being educated about colonial life, possibly in preparation for some kind of presentation or demonstration. But they were also being systematically isolated from the outside world." Morrison studied the children's drawings, which had been carefully preserved in plastic evidence bags. The artwork showed typical fourth-grade subjects: family portraits, houses, animals, and playground scenes. But several drawings depicted children in colonial clothing, working in gardens, preparing food, and participating in what appeared to be historical reenactments. One drawing, created by Jennifer Walsh, showed a group of children standing in front of a sailing ship with an adult figure in colonial dress. The caption, written in a child's handwriting, read, "Our New Life in Plymouth Colony." The drawing was dated December 2, 1983, 2 weeks after the field trip. The implications were staggering. If the dating was accurate, the children had been alive and creating artwork weeks after their disappearance. They'd been living in the hidden room, being taught about colonial life, and apparently preparing for something that required them to understand historical roles and customs. Chen located school records showing that Ellen Hartwell had been developing a new curriculum about experiential learning and historical immersion. She'd submitted a proposal to the Massachusetts Department of Education in early 1983, describing a program that would allow students to live history by spending extended periods in historically accurate environments. The proposal was ambitious and detailed, outlining a program where students would spend weeks in recreated historical settings, learning through direct experience rather than textbooks. The students would wear period clothing, eat historical foods, and perform daily tasks as children would have in earlier time periods. The program would culminate in a public demonstration, where students would showcase their learning to parents and community members. Morrison read through the proposal with growing unease. The program Hartwell had described matched exactly what appeared to have happened to the missing children. They'd been taken to a hidden location, taught about colonial life, and prepared for some kind of demonstration. But the demonstration had never occurred, at least not publicly. The investigation team began searching for any record of where the children might have been taken after their time in the hidden room. The room itself was clearly a temporary location designed to prepare the children for whatever came next. But where had they gone, and why had they never been found? Chen discovered that Robert Clemens had owned property throughout southeastern Massachusetts, including several acres of undeveloped land in rural areas. The property records showed that Clemens had purchased a 47-acre parcel in Carver, about 20 miles from Plymouth, in January 1983, just months before the disappearance. The land was heavily wooded and isolated, accessible only by a narrow dirt road. Morrison and Chen visited the Carver property on October 28th, accompanied by state police officers and a cadaver dog team. The land was overgrown with 40 years of forest growth, but they could still see evidence of human activity. Near the center of the property, they found the remains of several buildings, including what appeared to have been a large cabin and several smaller structures. The buildings had been burned, but the foundations remained intact. The main structure was approximately 60 feet by 40 feet, large enough to house a significant number of people. Surrounding it were the remains of smaller buildings that might have been workshops, storage facilities, or sleeping quarters. The cadaver dogs showed immediate interest in several areas around the burned buildings. The team began excavating, working slowly and methodically to preserve any evidence they might find. After 2 days of careful digging, they made a discovery that would haunt Morrison for the rest of her career. Buried in a carefully constructed gravesite behind the main building, they found the remains of 32 children. The bodies had been preserved by the acidic soil and cold temperatures, allowing forensic examination that would have been impossible under other conditions. Each child was dressed in colonial-era clothing, carefully sewn and historically accurate. They'd been buried with personal items, wooden toys, handmade dolls, and small tools appropriate to the colonial period. Dr. Vance's examination revealed that the children had died of carbon monoxide poisoning, likely from a faulty heating system in the main building. The deaths appeared to have been accidental, occurring during what might have been a severe winter storm. The children had been living in the buildings for approximately 2 months, from late November 1983 until early February 1984. But the most disturbing discovery was yet to come. In a small building that had served as a workshop, they found detailed journals written by Ellen Hartwell. The journals chronicled the entire experience, from the initial planning stages through the children's final days. Hartwell had documented everything with the meticulous attention to detail that had characterized her teaching career. The journals revealed that Hartwell and Clemens had indeed planned to create a revolutionary educational experience. They'd believed that modern children had become disconnected from history, that they needed to experience the hardships and challenges of earlier times to truly understand their heritage. The plan had been to keep the children in the colonial settlement for 6 months, teaching them to live as children would have in the 1620s. Hartwell had convinced herself that the children would benefit from the experience, that they would return to their families with a deeper understanding of history and a greater appreciation for modern conveniences. She'd planned to document the entire process, creating a book and educational materials that would revolutionize how history was taught in schools. The journals showed that initially, the plan had seemed to work. The children had adapted to colonial life, learning to cook over open fires, tend gardens, and perform daily tasks without modern technology. They'd been homeschooled using historically appropriate methods, learning to read from the Bible and write with quill pens. Hartwell had been convinced that the experience was transforming the children in positive ways. But as winter deepened, problems began to emerge. Several children became ill with respiratory infections that proved difficult to treat without modern medicine. Others became increasingly homesick and began to question why they couldn't return to their families. The isolation and harsh living conditions took a psychological toll that Hartwell hadn't anticipated. The final entries in the journal were increasingly desperate. Hartwell had realized that the experiment was failing, that the children were suffering in ways she hadn't predicted. She'd begun to understand that what she'd thought was education was actually kidnapping, that her vision of historical immersion was really child abuse. But by then, it was too late to simply return the children without facing serious criminal charges. The carbon monoxide poisoning had occurred on February 14, 1984. A severe winter storm had knocked out the main heating system, forcing the use of backup wood stoves that had been improperly installed. The children had died in their sleep, along with Ellen Hartwell and Robert Clemens. The three adults had been found in the main building, apparently having succumbed to the same toxic fumes. But the journals revealed one final, devastating secret. The bodies found at the site weren't all the victims. 3 children had survived the poisoning: Jennifer Walsh, Michael Rodriguez, and Katie Thompson. Hartwell's final journal entry, written just days before her death, described how she'd sent the 3 children to live with families in a remote religious community in northern Maine. The community, known as the New Covenant Settlement, had been established by religious fundamentalists who believed in living according to biblical principles. Hartwell had contacted the community's leader, a man named Brother Samuel, and arranged for the 3 children to be adopted by families within the settlement. The children had been given new names and identities, and were being raised as if they'd been born into the community. Morrison felt her hand shake as she read the final entry. 3 of the missing children were potentially still alive, now adults who might have no memory of their previous lives. The journal included the names of the families who'd adopted them, along with their new identities within the religious community. The investigation team immediately began working with Maine State Police to locate the New Covenant settlement. The community had disbanded in 1992, but records showed that several families had relocated to rural areas throughout northern Maine and New Brunswick. Finding the 3 survivors would require extensive detective work and careful coordination with Canadian authorities. Morrison called Elena Rodriguez, Michael's mother, to inform her of the discovery. The conversation was one of the most difficult of her career. Elena had spent 41 years hoping her son was alive, organizing searches, and maintaining faith that he would someday return home. Learning that he'd survived the initial disappearance but had been living under a different identity for decades was both a blessing and a profound tragedy. "Is he alive now?" Elena asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "We don't know yet," Morrison replied. "We're working with authorities in Maine to locate him. It's going to take time, but we're committed to finding him." The search for the 3 survivors became a race against time. The adults they'd become would now be in their early 50s, potentially with families and careers of their own. They might have no memory of their original identities, having been young enough when taken to the settlement to accept their new lives as reality. Chen coordinated with FBI agents in Maine, using facial recognition software to compare childhood photos of the missing children with driver's license photos from the relevant time periods. The process was complicated by the fact that the religious community had discouraged photography and maintained minimal official records. On November 15, 2024, just 3 days before the 41st anniversary of the disappearance, they found Michael Rodriguez. He was living in Bar Harbor, Maine, under the name Matthew Carpenter. He worked as a carpenter, was married with 2 children, and had no conscious memory of his life before age 8. The reunion with his mother was arranged carefully, with psychological counselors present to help both individuals process the emotional trauma. Elena Rodriguez, now 74, had never stopped believing her son was alive. When she saw the man he'd become, she recognized him immediately, despite 4 decades of separation. "I knew it was you," she said, holding his hands as tears streamed down her face. A mother always knows. Michael Matthew struggled with the revelation. He'd lived his entire adult life believing he was Matthew Carpenter, the son of devout religious parents who'd raised him in a small Maine community. Learning that his entire identity was based on a lie, that he'd been kidnapped as a child and given to strangers, shattered his understanding of himself. The psychological impact was profound. Michael began experiencing recovered memories of his childhood in Plymouth, fragments of his life before the disappearance. He remembered his mother's voice, his bedroom with its dinosaur decorations, and the excitement of preparing for the field trip. But he also struggled with guilt over the life he'd built as Matthew Carpenter, wondering if his wife and children could accept the truth about his past. Jennifer Walsh, now living as Sarah Miller in Calais, Maine, was located 2 days later. She'd become a teacher, unconsciously following the same career path as Ellen Hartwell. Her adoptive family had encouraged her love of learning, and she'd spent her adult life working with children in rural Maine schools. Jennifer's reunion with her family was complicated by the fact that her parents had both died in the intervening years. Her brother David, now 52, had become a police officer, partly inspired by his sister's disappearance. When Morrison contacted him, he was initially skeptical, having received false leads many times over the years. "I've been waiting for this call my whole life," David said when DNA testing confirmed Jennifer's identity, "but I never imagined it would come so late, or that the truth would be so complicated." Katie Thompson proved more difficult to locate. Records from the religious community showed that she'd been adopted by a family named the Shepherds, but they'd moved to New Brunswick in 1987. Canadian authorities eventually traced her to a small town near Fredericton, where she was living as Ruth Shepard. Katie had become a nurse, working in pediatric care at a regional hospital. She'd never married, instead dedicating her life to caring for children. When Morrison and Canadian authorities approached her, she initially refused to believe their explanation. The life she remembered as Ruth Shepard felt complete and real. She couldn't accept that it was built on a foundation of lies. The psychological evaluation of all 3 survivors revealed the long-term impact of their childhood trauma. While they'd been physically cared for in the religious community, the separation from their families and the lies about their identities had created deep psychological wounds. All 3 struggled with trust issues, relationship problems, and a sense of disconnection from their authentic selves. Dr. Amanda Foster, a specialist in trauma recovery, worked with the survivors to help them process their experiences. The therapeutic process was complicated by the fact that their abductors, Ellen Hartwell and Robert Clemens, had genuinely believed they were helping the children. This wasn't a case of obvious evil, but of misguided idealism that had caused immeasurable harm. "The psychological impact of this case is unique," Dr. Foster explained. "These individuals were victims of a crime, but they were also raised by people who loved them and provided for them. They're grieving not just for their lost childhoods, but for the identities they've had to abandon." The case attracted international attention, raising questions about child welfare, religious freedom, and the long-term effects of childhood trauma. The New Covenant settlement, while disbanded, had operated for over a decade without outside oversight, accepting children from various sources without proper documentation or legal procedures. Morrison found herself testifying before congressional committees about the need for better oversight of religious communities and improved coordination between law enforcement agencies. The case had exposed gaps in the system that had allowed children to disappear completely from official records. The families of the 29 children who died began the process of finally laying their loved ones to rest. The remains were returned to Plymouth for burial in a special section of Vine Hills Cemetery, with each child receiving a proper funeral service. The community that had searched for them for over 4 decades could finally grieve properly. Elena Rodriguez spoke at the memorial service, her voice strong despite her advanced age. "Our children are finally home," she said. "They've been on the longest field trip in history, but they're home now. And we have 3 miracles walking among us, proof that love and hope can survive even the darkest circumstances." The case officially closed on December 15, 2024, with the Massachusetts Attorney General's office issuing a comprehensive report on the investigation. The report detailed the failures in the original investigation, the innovative techniques used to solve the case, and recommendations for preventing similar tragedies in the future. Morrison retired from the Plymouth Police Department 6 months later, having achieved the career-defining case that every detective dreams of solving, but the victory felt hollow, tempered by the knowledge that 29 children had died and 3 others had lost their childhood identities because of misguided adults who'd convinced themselves they were acting in the children's best interests. The Mayflower II returned to service as a museum ship, but with enhanced security measures and new exhibits about the importance of protecting children from exploitation. The hidden room was preserved as part of a law enforcement training facility, teaching investigators about the sophisticated methods criminals use to conceal evidence. The case became a watershed moment for missing children investigations, demonstrating the importance of preserving evidence, maintaining hope, and never giving up on finding answers. It also highlighted the need for better understanding of how trauma affects memory and identity, particularly in cases involving young children. Michael Rodriguez, who chose to legally reclaim his original name while maintaining relationships with his main family, became an advocate for missing children. He worked with law enforcement agencies to improve investigation techniques and provided support to families dealing with similar tragedies. Jennifer Walsh returned to Massachusetts, taking a teaching position at a school just miles from where she'd been abducted. She specialized in working with traumatized children, using her unique perspective to help students who'd experienced their own forms of loss and displacement. Katie Thompson chose to remain in New Brunswick, but established a foundation that provided psychological support to families of missing children. Her work helped bridge the gap between the immediate crisis of a disappearance and the long-term healing process that families needed to survive. The case of the Plymouth Rock disappearance became a reminder that the truth, no matter how long buried, eventually finds its way to the surface. It showed that dedication, modern technology, and the refusal to give up hope could overcome even the most sophisticated attempts to hide the truth. But it also demonstrated that some wounds never fully heal, and that the impact of childhood trauma can echo through generations. Morrison often returned to Plymouth Rock, standing where the children had last been seen as free individuals. The memorial plaque installed there read simply, "In memory of 32 fourth graders who trusted adults to keep them safe. May their story remind us that our greatest responsibility is to protect those who cannot protect themselves." The waves continued to crash against the rocky shore, as they had for centuries. But now they carried with them the memory of children who'd been taken too soon, and the hope that their sacrifice had made the world a little safer for the children who would come after them. The case was closed, but its lessons would endure, carved into the collective memory of a community that had learned never to stop searching for the truth.